Hi everyone, this is John again, and I hope to share with you something pretty fascinating. Rather, since very young, I was always fascinated by the world of the Gypsies, even though I grew up in South Africa. I think some stories I heard, maybe some operas, maybe some music I heard inspired me to read a lot about the Gypsies, and I always imagined that I would live like a Gypsy, of which I did for a couple of years of my life. Um, Although I may not have met too many or lived with the Gypsies. The reason for that being is that Gypsies are very insular. It's incredibly difficult to get within their circles or to join them, either through marriage. Even that's very difficult because they don't like to marry outside of their community. But I can't underestimate the amount of influence that Gypsy culture and music has had on so much of our music today. So where are the Gypsies from? Before I get to talking too much, I would like to start showing you a couple of pictures to put you in the whole framework of Gypsy culture and the history. These are Gypsies in France. I'm wondering what Gypsies are doing in France. We always have the image of Gypsy caravans, which is their traditional way of moving around the world, which has changed considerably, especially since the Second World War. Here's some not so happy pictures of very poverty-stricken communities in places like Romania and Bulgaria. I came across Gypsies in Greece, and very often they live on the edge of society, very often in slum areas outside of big cities. There's a very typical picture. These pictures are taken from a National Geographic article from a couple of years ago. Let me show you some pictures of more traditional images, more positive images. Colorful caravans. In Greece, I would sometimes in the countryside find gypsies that would be traveling through small towns and that, often with a bear or playing music. This would not be an uncommon sight even back in the 1980s, 1981 and 1982. Here's this bear, and this guy with the bear is a gypsy. The bear is giving somebody in a town a massage by walking on his back. A lot of this activity has actually been stopped because they said that they were not treating the animals properly. Just bear with me. Gypsies dancing in nightclubs in places like Turkey. Okay, so why do gypsies have such a bad rap or such a bad reputation? And where do they come from? And what are their influences? And how come is it that they have influenced music so much? And often in places like Greece and Turkey, they are respected only maybe for their musical abilities, but in general society, they are really picked on and anyway, it's very challenging for them from what I understand, even in places like Bulgaria and Romania, where the government have tried to step in and help them. It seems like they are not interested in joining mainstream society. One of the biggest problems has been they've preferred not to send their kids to schools because they often say that, you know, life is the thing that educates you, not sitting in a classroom, which personally I believe there is some truth to that. But anyway, here's a rather sad picture. In the middle is somebody on a crutch with a picture of a saint. Here's a picture of a pregnant girl. As you can see, she's got some skin lesions on her. Anyway, that picture is actually fake. The person that took the picture found out afterwards that all those people were acting. The girl is not pregnant. The guy is not crippled. The other girl is not crippled either, but they were wearing a crutch. In Greece, I would quite often see gypsies down in an area called Monasteraki carrying babies. And of course, your heart goes out when you see a mother with a child and you want to help out, giving food or money. So it was a very typical type of scene. But where do they originate from? So originally, people thought that they came from Egypt, hence their name. One of their names that they're called is Gitanos, and that comes from the Greek word Egyptanos, somebody who comes from Egypt, which became Gitanos. And they took advantage, actually, in the Middle Ages, they took advantage of this identity confusion, as Europe was full then of pilgrims going from one cathedral or one church or one part of Europe to another, going through Romania, even many pilgrim places in France and Spain. They would travel, and they took advantage of this idea that they were actually pilgrims coming from Egypt, and that they were doing their pilgrimage because they had been sort of exiled for some reason or other. So people took pity on them and allowed them to stay on the land and to travel and move freely as they did. However, it turns out they are not from Egypt at all. They originally come, and this was realized or figured out because of the language. So they traced their language, and now, of course, with DNA testing, that's also a big help. They've traced them to northern India. Now, they're not sure why they left India and why this group of people from North India at some time moved to Persia. It is believed that some Persian king invited many of them to come, maybe because they were great musicians, or maybe because they were great soldiers. And it was a small army that moved, and at that time Persia was being attacked from the west by Muslim armies. And it's a possibility that these tribe of people came from northern India to help out in a war. And after the war, they just stayed there. But then soon after that, they broke up into different groups. And they spread out. And they are found all the way today, from Iran and Iraq, all the way to France and Spain and Portugal, Italy. Many places like Bulgaria, Romania, Poland have huge populations of gypsies. One of the problems during the Second World War, and people often think that it was only Jews that were sent to concentration camps, but actually many artists and musicians, or any free-thinking person or slightly different, and of course gay and transgender people as well, were thrown in concentration camps. The gypsies, because they had no really ruling class or no central group of people to protect them, and they had no land, no country to call their own, they were basically hunted like animals during the Second World War, and thousands of them died in concentration camps. Their main form of transport was horses and caravans, of which in places like France and Germany, the army used to come around and actually slaughter their horses and burn their caravans. A very, very sad reality. That's really a way to force people into starvation. So that's ultimately what happened during the Second World War. Places like France and Greece continue to have thriving communities of gypsies, often at loggerheads with the law, often having difficulty with society because they don't really want to fit in. However, in places like Greece and Turkey and in France, they are really admired on many levels for their musical abilities. Now, why that is still a mystery, and I've read up a lot about this. And some of the ideas that I've come up with was their way of creativity, maybe influenced by their early original music coming from India. And wherever they went, wherever they traveled, they absorbed the local culture and absorbed the local forms of music. In Europe today, many great violinists and santur and cimbalom players and guitar players are from Gypsy background. In Greece, they are known as great clarinet players, and I myself have seen some performances of clarinet up in northern Greece in some of the villages, and it is really mesmerizing and amazing. So before I talk anymore, I would like to stop for a second talking and actually listen to some of the Gypsy music. While you listen to the music, I'll find a few more photographs to show you so you don't have to sit there staring at me. This is from a group called Paprika Balkanicus, and I will list this in the notes and mention this in the assignments that you will have to do at the end of this talk. Just take notice of the cadence. continue to listen to this while I look for my charger for my iPhone. Okay, hope you enjoyed that. I'm looking for one more piece. Pictures from a gathering that I will explain a little bit about in a moment. Okay, so from that you would have heard, of course, taken notice, hopefully, of the beautiful violin and the approach to creating and moving between the notes. A lot of the music is not transcribed or written down. A lot of it is just memorized. A lot of these musician families, they grew up in families of musicians for generations. The music is passed on. So the next thing I want to play is from a group from Romania called Taraf da Haduks. You will see them on a documentary that you're going to be watching. They've become very well known, travel all over the world, but still maintain a very strong Gypsy culture. They still live in the same areas and neighborhoods where they have since they became famous. The second group is a band called Gypsy Kings, of which I do not have a recording of, but I want you to go online and take notice of and listen to them. They're from France. But anyway, now for Taraf da Haduks. Sorry. Sorry, having difficulty figuring out my iPod here. Okay, now take notice of this next Taraf Dahuduks, the changing rhythms and changing modes that they're using, and the freedom of expression. It's like jazz. It's really a folk jazz. Instruments you'll hear is clarinet, the cimbalom, and the violin predominate. Maybe some little sounds you may have heard with some ideas from classical music. Sorry, just searching for my glasses. Let me jump to another song. The cimbalom, which I spoke about before, is like the santur. Hopping to another song. Okay, so enough of listening for a moment. I hope you got a good taste of it. Some of you that may come from some European background, maybe Polish, maybe you've heard the polka, Hungarian, Greek, Turkish folk music, you may have made some connections there of some similarities and influences and styles and instruments. So where may you have ever heard of gypsies? I can't not mention two important stories. One is the opera Carmen, which really depicts the love and passion and intrigue of a gypsy woman, and the passionate story around that. The story of the opera comes from a story. It was adapted to opera, but that's a good example of where people first may have ever heard about gypsies. So it gives people a very specific idea about what gypsies are like. Another one is the famous story Les Miserables, the beautiful story by Victor Hugo, who was a Frenchman that was actually exiled from France at one point because of his political views. The Les Miserables story is really a depiction of class structure and struggles of the underprivileged people. That's really what he was trying to convey through that. Of course, Esmeralda is the gypsy girl, and what's the other? Quasimodo, the hunchback, and then Frollo, the archdeacon. These three characters. It's based what the whole story is about, and it depicts also the falling in love of Frollo and Quasimodo with her, and with the whole story of Esmeralda. It comes around, and it's basically a very intriguing story, and it depicts a little bit about maybe what life was like for gypsies at the time. Things have not changed that much. Europe right now is in crisis. France is in crisis in relationship to its gypsies. I know for a fact that in places like Greece, many small communities are struggling with trying to settle gypsies, trying to force their kids to go to school, trying to get people to settle down and adjust to modern life. But it's been very challenging. So there are some pros and some cons to that. However, why are gypsies known to be such great musicians? It's still a mystery. I personally think it's because of their lifestyle and being out of society and the challenges and the hardships that they deal with. Maybe that's their story that they're telling through their music. So a very important festival happens in the south of France. Let me just get my notes here so I'll give you the names, the proper names of these places. Okay, it's in the south of France. Okay, so here's the story. It's in a place called Las Saintes Maries de la Mar. Now, the gypsies, when they were in Iran and Iraq and these places, they often adopted Islam as a religion. Whether they really practiced it seriously or whether they used it just so that they wouldn't be condemned even more than what they are, is a questionable concept. In places like France, they often may be very devoted Catholics, I'm not sure, but they often adopted the local religion. And in the case of France, there is a very interesting story about this place. There is an image of a black saint, and this image is in a big cathedral in this town, Maries de la Mar. And the gypsies from all over Europe see this saint as their patron saint. So thousands of them flock to this area once a year. The story goes, how it originated was Mary Magdalene and who the other characters? Mary Magdalene, the sister, Mary Jacobi, the sister of the mother of Jesus, Mary Salome, the mother of the apostles John and James, and the resurrected Lazarus show up on this beach together with an Egyptian servant, maidservant, a black woman. And she becomes a saint, and she becomes the patron saint of the gypsies. Now, this is a great opportunity for gypsies to get together, especially from France. And for hundreds of years, they've been gathering there. And you will see some of these images in a documentary that you're going to watch. And you will also be writing a little bit about this story. So I'd like you to know about the story in one of your main assignment related to this documentary that you're going to watch. The interesting thing is this image of the saint is dipped into the sea. It's taken out from the cathedral and they put it in the ocean and then put it back in the cathedral. Now, this is very similar to a Hindu practice where they take the deity out and they wash it in water, or they take it to the Ganges River and wash it, or in certain cases like the ceremony for the worship of the goddess in India, whether it's Kali Ma, which the Gypsies call this image Kali Ma, which is the same as the goddess, the Hindu goddess Kali. So I'm seeing some correlation there and some similarities. And hopefully you'll read up a little bit more about this story. Now, to come on to a group that lives in the south of France, their forefathers were exiled from Spain during the Spanish Civil War. And it's a very famous group called the Gypsy Kings. And they live in the south of France. They have traveled the world many, many times performing. They have huge record sales. They've had 2 or 3 very big hits. And they've been performing around the world for a very long time now. I would like to read a little quote to you by the lead singer. His name is Nicolas Reyes. He says, "At first we were nervous to face the world. Now it is our life. After all, we have been travelers for centuries. We have just exchanged our caravans for cars and planes. Now the cops are in front of us, not behind us," referring to the fact that in most Gypsy communities they're so tired of being harassed by the police all the time. And now he's saying, when we're on stage, the police are in front of us, admiring us. And truly their music has become an expression and a reflection of Gypsy culture. And from this I'd like to just read something else from an article that I was hoping you were going to be able to read in the Songlines magazines about the Gypsy Kings, but seeing as we're not having school this semester and everything is online, I would just like to read it for you. So people listening to the Gypsy Kings, especially in Europe, that have a bad attitude about the Gypsies, maybe when they hear the Gypsy Kings and they see their success and what incredible musicians they are, it will hopefully change some attitudes about the Gypsies. And that growing acceptance and understanding and tolerance of a people who had for centuries been treated as outsiders may just have been the Gypsy Kings' greatest success of all. When the group's grandparents arrived in southern France before World War II, they were marginalized and forced into segregated poverty of trailer communities, excluded from the French schooling system. Their children and grandchildren grew up illiterate, but there was always music, and eventually it would become their passport to acceptance by mainstream society. And I feel the same goes for many great musicians in places like Greece and Turkey, that it's through music that they get accepted and admired for their musicality. Now, we listened to some interesting Gypsy music already. I'd like to mention we cannot forget about the importance of Gypsy influences in Western classical music. Now, in major textbooks that are used in universities and that, especially in music departments, there is very little, if any, or no mention about Gypsy influence. Again, this is often because of a biased, highly educated people writing these textbooks very often are closed off to the idea that they were or have been any influences by the Gypsies. But it is obvious people that are interested in it and have researched it are very clear in the fact that many great composers like Liszt, I have a list here of many compositions that have Gypsy influences in them. Let me just find my paper. Okay, some of them you may have heard of before: Haydn, Dvorak, Schubert, Brahms, and of course Beethoven. Regarding Beethoven, many people in conservatories today are accepting the fact that this insistence on playing the music exactly as it was written down is great for and important when writing and performing music in the context of an orchestra. but people like Beethoven that were also incredible improvisers, and this is very often forgotten about. As a matter of fact, the highest value of Gypsy music is the interpreter's creativity, their inspiration, charisma, and communicative power that produce an immediate fascination. But it is important to delve further into the creative function of Gypsy musicians and their role in a particular field such as classical music, determined by strict classical rules where even cadence must be written down as sheet music, because classical interpreters renounce the value and daily compromise of improvisation. I think I gave you an example of that when I had been living in Greece and I had played at a conference for East-West music, and I was with students from the Guildhall School of Music, and out of about 30 students, only 2 musicians in the whole orchestra were willing to perform with me at the end of the conference for a performance, because nobody else in the orchestra was able to create on the spot and improvise. The only 2 people that could were actually 2 musicians from New York, 2 black guys, a violin player and a flute player. They were very comfortable. I gave them an idea of a raga I was playing, and we ended up performing for an hour. We had a great time, but none of the other musicians in the orchestra were able to, or felt comfortable just being spontaneous and playing music on the spot. So many authors and Beethoven specialists, Luca Chiaronto among them, have vindicated in recent years his genius for improvisation as the true driving force of his music. In fact, the value of improvisation is being reclaimed more and more by advanced conservatories and elite schools as a fundamental part of music creation, something known by experience to early and Baroque music specialists, and which has been central in Gypsy music from its beginning. So one of the assignments you're going to be doing is writing a paper on at least a couple of paragraphs on a famous composer, Bela Bartok, or Bartok. I'm not sure how it's pronounced. I think it's written with a K, Bartok, but I think it's pronounced Bartok. You will write a short paper about him because he's considered the father of ethnomusicology. He traveled around Europe, especially Hungary and these places, and Romania, I think, and gathered a lot of folk melodies, and he actually wrote some piano pieces for children, and all these were based on Gypsy folk tunes. So just moving on from here, of course, Ravel and a very famous Spanish composer, Isaac Albéniz, of which you're also going to read up about. He's a famous piano composer, and quite a few of his pieces were transcribed and that are now performed more on guitar than on piano, because originally he was a guitar player. Then he started performing on the piano. He was a childhood prodigy. He traveled around the world at a very young age. I think he was performing all over Europe from the age of 18 or 19. Seems like his father was in the... I think his father was a customs officer, and that gave him the freedom to travel a lot, and he traveled with his father on these performances. There's a story that he actually ran away from home at 18 to go and perform, but they actually proved that actually his father and him traveled a lot together, and he performed a lot. So his music is very influenced by Gypsy music. And from here we're moving more into the realms of flamenco music, of which I'm going to do a separate talk about flamenco music, because it's another wonderful, fascinating form of music, very related, of course, to gypsies and gypsy music. They're interrelated. You can't separate the two. In South Spain, they say that it's only the true gypsies can actually play flamenco music. However, and here's my dog. For flamenco competitions, a lot of Japanese and Asian kids are winning competitions today. So even they're trying to control the competitions and say that non-gypsies are not really allowed to enter these competitions. So anyway, flamenco music, that will be another whole section, not long, just another short section to finish off before we move on to touching on reggae and Rastafari. Let me just check my notes, make sure that I haven't missed anything. Okay, finally but not least, I will post underneath this video a big assignment and the link to a documentary that you need to watch. You don't need to watch from point A to point Z the whole documentary, but please, you do need to give me a rundown of this lecture as you did before for the previous lectures, and then the documentary on the Gypsies. I want you to watch it and take notes while you're watching it. Take note of the countries that they move through. It actually starts in India and ends up all the way in Spain, taking you through this whole travel of the Gypsies and how different communities in different parts of the world have these Gypsy communities and how their music is and how different it is. It starts off beautifully in North India, with something that you've been exposed to before in the previous documentary you watched on the Sufis. I remember in the Sufi film you saw this thing called the whirling dance of the dervishes, how they spin around. And in that movie it was mostly taken in Turkey, with these men wearing these white gowns with these tall hats and with these beautiful white skirts spinning. But there was also some scenes in North India and Pakistan of people dancing a little bit more wild but also spinning, where William Dalrymple mentions that in these type of tombs or places where these Sufis meet, it's not so much a classical thing like it is with the whirling dervishes of Turkey and the followers of Rumi. There it was a little bit more folk, a little bit more wild and spontaneous. Interestingly, this documentary on the Gypsies, Lochadrom, that you're going to watch, starts off in North India with in Rajasthan, in the desert of Rajasthan, and with gypsies there, and this young girl doing a dance. So maybe you'll see some similarities there. So please take notes of that, not too long, but some notes. I do want to know that you have watched that documentary. It is very important. And please make sure, even if you miss maybe a little bit in the middle, I will write it out in the notes and the assignment that you have to watch. You need to focus definitely on the parts of Turkey and in France, and what happens to France, what happens to the Gypsies and at that festival for Sarah. And then we move to France. Move to Spain. But an important musician that I should have got into a little earlier, but I'm finishing off with, is a musician by the name of Django Reinhardt. Now, if any of you are interested in Second World War history and that era, there is an incredible documentary about this man and his music. It's called Django Reinhardt, not Django the cowboy, but Django Reinhardt the musician. It's a beautiful story based on a true life story of this musician who has influenced, many consider him to be the biggest influence in jazz guitar playing. He was by birth a gypsy, and he spent many years of his life living as a gypsy. He became pretty well known, and he used to play with a famous violin player, Stefan Grappelli, and they had the quartet of the Hot Jazz Club in Paris. Before that was disbanded during the Second World War, and he had to flee. But his guitar playing has influenced everything from jazz to swing to even country music today. A genius guitarist, and please either watch the movie about him, but that style of jazz music comes up in the Lochadrom documentary that you're watching on the Gypsies when they're in France. In the place where they're having the service for Saint Maria, these musicians gather, and that style of music that they're playing is called Django Jazz. It has become very popular in the even Django Jazz festivals all over the country, including Southern York. Every year there's a small Django festival. That's a very popular style of guitar playing. An interesting thing happened to him when he was at the peak of his fame. he had a terrible accident. His caravan burned down. He was living in a caravan. It burned down, and he lost the use of his fourth and fifth finger, which is very important for guitar. They sort of bonded together. And then when he was recovering in hospital, he requested his guitar, and straight away he started to practice and developed guitar skills which were incredible. He adjusted his chords and everything. Some people believe that because of his limitation of his burnt fingers, he created ways to play chords which changed the chords a little bit, which led to some of the jazz chords being played today. So that's not a certain theory, but some people have this idea that that's how some of these jazz chords on guitar came to be. Interesting use of bar chords in that. But anyway, please look that up and take special notice of the section in France for the Lochadrom documentary. So that's enough music for today and enough of my talking. I hope you have found this lecture interesting. And I look forward to just finishing off. The one on flamenco music will be fairly short before we move on. So take care, everyone. Take notice of the notes that I have written underneath this lecture.